Elena Whitmore stood in the middle of the grand hall, and her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone around her could hear it. The lights above her were bright and gold, and the air smelled like fresh flowers and expensive perfume. Hundreds of people were watching. This was the bonding ceremony, the event that would decide who she would marry, and in a few seconds, her whole future would be announced in front of everyone she knew. She had worn a simple blue dress, nothing too flashy, because her mother told her not to draw too much attention. Her hands were shaking slightly as she waited for her name to be called. She had heard stories about this ceremony her whole life. The matchmakers studied family backgrounds, personalities, and social standing, and then they paired people together in front of both families. It was old-fashioned, but in her city, it still carried enormous weight. Everyone who mattered came to watch. When the announcer called her name, Elena stepped forward. Her legs felt stiff, like they belonged to someone else. She looked across the hall and saw him standing there. Julian Ashford. Everyone knew who he was. He was the son of one of the wealthiest families in the region, tall, sharp-featured, with dark hair combed back perfectly, and a suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. He looked bored, like he had already decided how this evening would end before it even began. The matchmaker, a stern older woman named Laura, read out the details of the pairing. She explained that Elena and Julian had been chosen as a match based on family compatibility and mutual social standing. The room fell silent, waiting for Julian's response, because tradition required the man to accept the match publicly before it became official. Julian looked at Elena for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds that would change the rest of her life. Then he turned to Laura and said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear, "This isn't who I pictured. I don't think this match works for me." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Elena felt her face go hot, then cold, then hot again. She had never been rejected in public before, not like this, not in front of hundreds of people who would talk about it for weeks. She saw her mother's face freeze in shock near the front row. She saw her father clench his jaw. She saw strangers whispering behind their hands, already turning this moment into gossip they would carry home with them. Julian didn't apologize. He simply stepped back and gestured for the ceremony to continue, as if he hadn't just humiliated a stranger in front of the entire city's elite. Laura, flustered, tried to smooth things over, suggesting they take a moment, but Julian was already looking past Elena, scanning the room for someone else, someone who matched whatever picture he had in his mind. Elena stood frozen for a moment. She could feel every pair of eyes in the room on her. She thought about crying, but something inside her refused to let the tears fall. Not here, not in front of these people. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and turned around. She walked out of the hall without saying a word. Behind her, she heard murmurs rising like a wave, but she didn't look back. She walked past the long table of desserts nobody had touched yet, past the string quartet that had stopped playing out of confusion, past her cousin who reached out a hand to stop her and then thought better of it. She pushed open the heavy doors at the back of the hall and stepped out into the cool night air. Outside, the city lights blinked in the distance. Elena stood on the marble steps of the venue and finally let herself breathe. Her chest felt tight, like something had been squeezed out of her in that hall. She pressed her palm against the stone railing to steady herself. Her sister, Grace, found her there a few minutes later. Grace had run out after her, her heels clicking loudly against the steps. "Elena," Grace said, slightly out of breath, "are you all right? That man is unbelievable. Who does he think he is?" Elena shook her head slowly. "I don't want to talk about it right now. Mom is inside, trying to fix things with Laura. She thinks maybe there's been some mistake. Maybe they can rematch you with someone else tonight." At those words, something shifted inside Elena. The shock was starting to fade, and in its place came a sharp, clear anger. Not just at Julian, but at the entire idea that she needed to be rematched immediately, as if being rejected once wasn't enough of a wound, and now she had to stand there and be evaluated again, like a product returned to a shelf.
"No,"
Elena said firmly. "I'm not going back in there." Grace blinked. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm done. I'm done with the ceremony. I'm done with tonight. And honestly, I think I'm done with all of this." Elena gestured vaguely toward the building behind them, toward the whole tradition of matchmaking and family arrangements that had ruled her life since she turned 18. "You don't mean that," Grace said gently. You're just upset. Anyone would be. Maybe I am upset, Elena admitted. But I also mean it. I'm not going to stand in another room and let someone look at me for 3 seconds and decide I'm not good enough. Not again. Grace didn't argue further. She simply put her arm around her sister's shoulders, and the two of them stood there together, watching the cars pull in and out of the driveway, listening to the faint music still playing inside. Meanwhile, inside the hall, the ceremony continued without Elena. Julian was matched instead with a young woman named Charlotte Bellamy, the daughter of a business partner of his father's. The match was announced with polite applause, and Julian accepted it with the same detached expression he had worn all evening. To him, this was simply how things worked. Marriages in his family were business decisions dressed up in ceremony and tradition. He had learned long ago not to expect anything more from these events. He did not think about Elena again that night, or at least, that was what he told himself. Elena's parents were mortified by what had happened. Her mother, Diane, kept apologizing to anyone who would listen, as if the rejection had somehow been Elena's fault. Her father, Henry, said very little, but Elena could see the disappointment in his eyes when they finally left the venue together. It wasn't disappointment in her exactly, but in the situation, in the way the evening had gone so differently from what they had hoped. The drive home was silent, except for the sound of tires on the road. Elena sat in the back seat, staring out the window at the passing streetlights, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. 3 seconds. That was all it had taken for a stranger to decide she wasn't worth his time, and the worst part was that she would probably never even understand why. Was it her dress? Her family's standing? Something about the way she looked or carried herself? She would never know, and somehow that uncertainty hurt more than a clear reason would have. When they arrived home, Elena went straight to her room and closed the door. She sat on the edge of her bed for a long time without moving. The house was quiet. She could hear her parents talking in low voices downstairs, probably discussing what this meant for the family's reputation, what people would say, how quickly the story would spread. Elena looked at herself in the mirror across the room. She still wore the blue dress, though it no longer felt special. It felt like a costume from a play that had gone terribly wrong. She studied her own reflection for a long moment, trying to see what Julian had seen, trying to understand what had made him so quick to dismiss her. She couldn't find an answer, and eventually, she stopped looking for one. Instead, something new began to form in her chest, something that felt less like sadness and more like resolve. She thought about all the years she had spent preparing for a life chosen by other people, following rules set by tradition, waiting for someone else to decide her worth. She thought about the design courses she had always wanted to take but never pursued because her family considered them impractical, a hobby rather than a future. She thought about the apartment across town that a friend had mentioned was available, small but affordable, far from the world of ceremonies and matchmakers and family expectations. For the first time in a long while, Elena allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life, one that didn't depend on being chosen by anyone. The next morning, she woke up early, before the rest of the house was awake. She sat at her desk and began writing a list. Not a list of grievances or excuses, but a list of things she wanted to do. Enroll in the design program, find her own apartment, build something that belonged entirely to her. By the time her mother knocked on her door to check on her, Elena had already made up her mind. "I'm all right," she told her mother, when Diane asked how she was feeling. "I'm better than all right, actually." Diane looked confused, unsure how to respond to her daughter's sudden calm. She had expected tears, or anger, or at least some sign of the humiliation from the night before. Instead, she found Elena sitting at her desk, dressed and ready for the day, with a quiet determination in her eyes that Diane didn't fully recognize. "What are you planning?" Diane asked carefully. "I'm going to start over," Elena said simply. "Somewhere new. Somewhere that isn't about being picked or rejected by strangers." Diane wanted to argue, to remind her daughter of family obligations and social expectations, but something in Elena's expression stopped her. Perhaps it was the first time she had seen real strength in her daughter's face, the kind that comes only after being broken down completely and choosing to rebuild anyway. Across the city, in a very different house, Julian Ashford woke up that same morning and thought briefly about the previous night's ceremony. He remembered Charlotte's polite smile when they were matched, remembered his father's satisfied nod from across the hall. He did not think about the woman he had dismissed. Not really. Not in any way that felt significant. He had no idea that the moment he had barely registered would come to define the next 5 years of his life. He had no idea that the 3 seconds he spent looking at Elena Whitmore before turning away would eventually become the thing he thought about more than anything else in the world. But that morning, he simply got dressed, went to work, and moved forward with his life, as though nothing unusual had happened at all. Elena, meanwhile, packed the first box of her belongings before breakfast. She did not know yet where this new path would lead her, only that she was finally choosing it herself. And as she taped the box closed and set it by her bedroom door, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt free. 3 weeks after the bonding ceremony, Elena stood in the doorway of a small apartment on the other side of the city, holding a set of keys that felt heavier than they should have. The building was old but well kept, with creaky wooden stairs, and a window in the living room that looked out over a quiet street lined with coffee shops and small bookstores. It wasn't grand, and it certainly wasn't what she had grown up with, but it was hers. She had not told anyone outside her immediate family about her plans until they were already in motion. By the time her extended relatives heard that Elena had moved out and enrolled in a design program, there was nothing left for them to say that would change her mind. Some of them whispered that she was running away from her embarrassment. Others said she had lost her mind, giving up a comfortable life for uncertainty. Elena heard the rumors secondhand, through Grace, who reported them with a kind of amused frustration. "They act like you committed a crime," Grace said one evening, sitting cross-legged on Elena's new second-hand couch. "You just moved apartments and started school. People act like the world is ending." "It's not about the apartment," Elena said, sipping tea from a chipped mug she had found at a market stall. "It's about what it represents. I stopped waiting for someone to choose me. That scares people who still believe in the old way of doing things." Grace smiled, though there was concern behind her eyes. "Are you happy though? Really?" Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "I'm not sure happy is the right word yet, but I feel like myself for the first time in years. That has to count for something." The design program Elena joined was intense, filled with long nights of drafting, critiques from instructors who did not soften their feedback, and constant comparison to classmates who seemed to have been preparing for this career their entire lives. Elena had not. She was starting late, learning software and techniques that others already knew, and there were moments in those early weeks when she doubted whether she had made the right choice. But she kept going. She stayed after class to practice sketches. She spent her weekends visiting buildings around the city, studying how light moved through different spaces, how color and material changed the feeling of a room. Slowly, her instructors began to notice her improvement. One of them, a sharp-tongued woman named Sophie who ran the advanced studio, pulled Elena aside after a critique session in her second month. "You have an instinct for warmth," Sophie told her. "Most people your age design spaces that look impressive in photographs, but feel cold to actually live in. You do the opposite. Keep that. Don't let anyone train it out of you." The compliment meant more to Elena than she expected. It was the first time in a long while that someone had recognized something valuable in her without any connection to her family name or her marriage prospects. It was recognition earned entirely on her own terms. Still, the humiliation of the bonding ceremony did not disappear completely. It surfaced in quiet moments, usually late at night, when the apartment was silent, and her mind wandered back to that grand hall, to the sound of Julian's voice announcing that she wasn't what he pictured. She hated that the memory still had power over her, hated that a stranger's careless words could still make her stomach twist months later. She never spoke about it in her design classes, never let it define how she introduced herself to new people. But it lived somewhere inside her, quiet and unresolved. Her parents visited occasionally, though the visits were often tense. Diane still hoped Elena would eventually return to the matchmaking circle, still believed that a good marriage was the safest path forward for her daughter. Henry said little on the subject, but Elena could tell he was proud of her independence, even if he struggled to express it directly. He would ask about her coursework, examine her sketches with genuine interest, and occasionally slip her a bit of money for supplies, even though she insisted she didn't need it. One afternoon, several months into her program, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Laura, the matchmaker from the ceremony, appeared at her apartment door, looking slightly out of place in the modest hallway. "I wanted to apologize properly," Laura said, once Elena had reluctantly invited her inside. What happened that night should never have been allowed to unfold the way it did. It reflected poorly on the entire ceremony, and on me as well. Elena studied the older woman for a moment before responding. "You don't need to apologize for someone else's rudeness." "Perhaps not," Laura said, "but I feel responsible nonetheless. I have been doing this work for many years, and I have never seen a rejection handled so publicly, so carelessly. I wanted you to know that Julian Ashford's behavior that night was unusual, even by the standards of a family known for being difficult." Elena wasn't sure what to do with that information. Part of her wanted to dismiss it entirely, to insist she had already moved past the incident, and didn't need details about the man who had humiliated her. But another part of her, quieter and more curious, wanted to understand. "What do you mean, difficult?" she asked. Laura hesitated, as though weighing how much to share. The Ashford family treats these ceremonies as business transactions. Julian has always gone along with that, at least outwardly. But something about that night was different. I have arranged many matches in my career, and I have never seen a young man look so certain and so uncertain at the same time. Elena frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "No," Laura agreed. "It didn't make sense to me either. But I have learned that people's public behavior does not always match what is happening underneath. That's all I wanted to say. I don't expect it to change how you feel about that evening, and it shouldn't. You deserved better treatment than you received, regardless of whatever was happening in his mind." After Laura left, Elena sat by her window for a long time, watching the street below, turning the conversation over in her thoughts. She told herself it didn't matter what had been happening in Julian Ashford's mind that night. He had made his choice, publicly and without hesitation, and she had made hers in response. Whatever internal conflict he may have experienced was not her responsibility to untangle. Still, she found herself thinking about him more than she wanted to admit over the following weeks. Not with longing, not with hope for some future reconciliation, but with a kind of unresolved curiosity, the way a person might wonder about an unfinished story they had been forced to walk away from before the ending. She pushed the thoughts aside as best she could and focused on her work instead. Her design portfolio was growing steadily, and Sophie encouraged her to begin taking on small freelance projects outside of class, helping local shop owners redesign their spaces on modest budgets. The work was challenging but deeply satisfying. For the first time, Elena began to see a version of her future that had nothing to do with ceremonies or family arrangements, a future built entirely from her own choices and her own hands. By the end of that first year, Elena had completed her program, with strong recommendations from her instructors, secured her first paid design contract with a small bakery near her apartment, and begun to build a modest but genuine reputation in the local design community. She rarely thought about the bonding ceremony anymore, at least not during her waking hours. When she did think of Julian Ashford, it was fleeting, more like a scar that no longer ached but still occasionally reminded her it existed. She had no way of knowing that, across the city, in a house far grander than her own, a man was beginning to feel the weight of a decision he could not quite explain even to himself, a decision that would eventually pull him back into her life, whether she wanted it or not. But for now, Elena Whitmore was simply living, one project at a time, one quiet victory at a time, finally building a life that belonged entirely to her. Charlotte Bellamy adjusted the collar of her coat as she walked through the marble entrance of the Ashford estate for the first time as its newest resident. The wedding had taken place 2 months after the bonding ceremony, arranged quickly by both families to secure a partnership that had been years in the making. It was, by every outward measure, a successful match. Charlotte's family owned a chain of hotels across the region, and Edward Ashford, Julian's father, had long wanted to merge their business interests through marriage. The wedding had been elegant, photographed extensively, and celebrated by everyone who mattered in their social circle. Julian stood beside his new wife that first evening in their shared home, accepting congratulations from relatives and business associates who had stayed late into the night. He smiled when he was expected to smile, said the right things when he was expected to say them, and by all appearances, seemed content with how his life had unfolded. But later, once the guests had gone and the house had fallen quiet, Julian found himself standing alone on the balcony outside his bedroom, looking out over the manicured gardens below. Charlotte had already gone to sleep, exhausted from the long day. He should have felt satisfied. He had done exactly what was expected of him, secured a beneficial match, pleased his father, and avoided any of the messy complications that came with choosing a partner, based on something as unreliable as personal feeling. Instead, he felt strangely hollow. He told himself it was simply exhaustion from the wedding, or nerves about beginning married life, or the pressure of knowing that his father now expected him to take on greater responsibility within the family business. He told himself many things over the following weeks, searching for an explanation that made sense, one that didn't involve the uncomfortable memory that kept resurfacing at inconvenient moments. He thought of the woman from the bonding ceremony more often than he wanted to admit. Not because he regretted marrying Charlotte, at least not in any way he could clearly articulate, but because something about that night continued to bother him in a way he couldn't fully explain. He remembered the way she had walked out of the hall, spine straight, without a single tear visible, without begging for a second chance or causing a scene. Most people, he imagined, would have reacted very differently to public rejection. She had simply turned and left, with a dignity that had struck him even as he stood there, having caused the very humiliation she was walking away from. He had not planned to reject her. That was the strange part. He had walked into the ceremony that night already frustrated, having argued with his father earlier in the day about the terms of the family business, feeling like every decision in his life had already been made for him, before he had any say in it. When Laura called Elena Whitmore's name, and the two of them were paired together, something in Julian had rebelled. Not against Elena specifically, but against the entire process, against the feeling of being handed a wife, the same way he was handed board meeting schedules and quarterly reports. He had said the first thing that came into his frustrated mind, and he had said it in the cruelest possible way, in front of the entire hall, without any thought for the person standing across from him. It was only afterward, replaying the moment in his head during quiet, sleepless nights, that he began to understand how much damage those few careless words must have caused. He had not simply rejected a stranger. He had humiliated a real person, publicly, without cause or explanation, based on nothing more than his own personal frustration with a system he resented. The guilt did not appear all at once. It crept in slowly, over months, growing heavier each time Julian caught himself wondering what had happened to her, where she had gone, whether she was all right. Charlotte noticed the change in him, though she couldn't quite name it. He was polite, attentive when required, generous with his time and resources, but there was a distance in him that never fully closed. She assumed, at first, that it was simply his nature, that some men were naturally reserved, and it had nothing to do with her. She busied herself with managing the household and expanding her family's hotel business into new markets, and for a while, the marriage functioned smoothly enough on the surface. But distance, left unaddressed, tends to grow rather than shrink. Julian threw himself into his work at the family company, taking on projects that kept him away from home for long stretches, telling himself it was simply ambition, simply the natural progression of a young executive proving himself to his father. His father, Edward, was pleased with his son's dedication, unaware that much of it stemmed from an unwillingness to sit still long enough to confront the discomfort waiting for him at home. One evening, nearly a year into his marriage, Julian attended a business dinner where the conversation briefly turned to the old matchmaking ceremonies, and someone mentioned, almost in passing, a story about a woman who had walked out of her own bonding ceremony without a word. The room laughed, treating it as an amusing piece of social gossip, a story about a stubborn young woman who had embarrassed herself by leaving so dramatically. Julian did not laugh. He sat very still, his glass halfway to his lips, as the memory rushed back with unexpected force. He realized, with a strange kind of clarity, that the woman in that story was not the one who had embarrassed herself that night. He had been the one who caused the scene. She had simply refused to stay and be humiliated further. That night, driving home from the dinner, Julian found himself thinking, for the first time with real honesty, about what kind of man he wanted to be. He thought about his father, who had built an entire life around calculated decisions and strategic alliances, who measured success purely in terms of business outcomes and social standing. He thought about the quiet unhappiness that seemed to live beneath his parents' long, successful marriage, a marriage that worked perfectly on paper, but seemed to lack any real warmth underneath. He did not want that for himself, and yet he realized, with growing discomfort, that he was already building the same kind of life, the same kind of hollow success, simply by following the path that had been laid out for him without question. He did not act on these realizations immediately. Change rarely comes all at once, and Julian was not a man accustomed to examining his own choices too closely. But something had shifted in him that night, a small crack in the foundation of the life he had accepted without protest. Over the following months, that crack widened. His marriage to Charlotte, never built on much beyond convenience and family expectation, began to strain under the weight of two people who had never truly connected in any meaningful way. They were polite to each other, professional even, but the warmth that should have grown between them over time simply never developed. Charlotte, sensing the distance, eventually stopped trying to close it, and instead focused her energy on her own ambitions, expanding her family's business with the same determination Julian applied to his. By the second anniversary of their marriage, both of them privately understood that something essential was missing, though neither said so openly. They continued to appear together at public events, continued to maintain the appearance of a successful partnership, because ending the marriage would mean disrupting the business arrangement their families had built it upon. Julian buried himself further in work, taking on international projects that kept him traveling for weeks at a time. During one such trip, staying in a hotel in a city far from home, he found himself unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of an unfamiliar room, and he finally allowed himself to admit something he had been avoiding for a long time. He wanted to find her, not out of romantic longing, or at least that was what he told himself at the time, but out of a genuine need to apologize, to explain himself, to somehow make right what he had gotten so wrong that night at the bonding ceremony. The thought had been building in him for months, maybe longer, and that night, alone in a hotel room thousands of miles from home, he finally let himself acknowledge it fully. He did not know where Elena Whitmore was, or what had become of her life since that evening. He did not know if she would even want to see him, if given the chance, but the need to find her, to understand what he had done, and try to repair some small piece of it, had grown too strong to ignore any longer. The search, though he did not know it yet, would take him nearly 3 more years to complete. 3 years after the bonding ceremony, Elena Whitmore stood inside a half-finished restaurant space, directing 2 workers as they installed a wall of reclaimed wood panels along the far side of the room. Sawdust hung faintly in the air, mixing with the smell of fresh paint. This was her 4th major commercial project that year, and her small design studio, which she had started in the spare room of her apartment, had grown into a proper office with 3 employees and a growing list of clients who sought her out specifically for her warm, human-centered approach to interior spaces. She had named the studio Whitmore Design, a decision that had felt bold at the time, claiming her own name for something built entirely by her own effort. Her early clients had been small businesses, shops and cafes willing to take a chance on a young designer, with limited experience but obvious talent. Word had spread slowly at first, then more quickly, as satisfied clients recommended her to friends and colleagues. By the end of her 2nd year, she was turning down more projects than she accepted, a fact that still occasionally surprised her when she stopped to think about it. "The east wall needs another coat before we move the shelving in," Elena said, stepping back to examine the work with a critical eye. One of the workers, a young man named Nathan, who had recently joined her team as an assistant designer, nodded and made a note on his tablet. "You know," Nathan said, once the other worker had stepped away, "most designers your age are still working under someone else, learning the business from the bottom. You built this whole thing yourself in 3 years." Elena smiled, though she waved off the compliment with practiced ease. "I had a lot of help along the way, and honestly, a good amount of stubbornness." "Stubbornness is underrated," Nathan said. "It gets a bad reputation, but half the successful people I know are just stubborn in the right direction." Elena laughed at that, genuinely. The kind of laugh that came easily now in a way it hadn't for a long time after the ceremony. She had built a life that felt entirely her own, filled with work she loved, friendships she had chosen rather than inherited, and a growing sense of confidence that no longer depended on anyone else's approval. Her relationship with her parents had softened over the years as well. Diane had stopped pushing the subject of marriage quite so aggressively, especially once Elena's design career began generating real income and recognition. Henry had become one of Elena's most enthusiastic supporters, often stopping by job sites unannounced just to see his daughter's work in progress, standing quietly in the background with obvious pride on his face. Grace, who had gone on to study law, remained Elena's closest confidant. The two sisters met for dinner most weeks, trading stories about their respective careers, and it was during one of these dinners, nearly 3 years after the ceremony, that Grace brought up a piece of news that made Elena's stomach tighten unexpectedly. "Did you hear about the Ashford divorce?" Grace asked, twirling pasta around her fork with studied casualness. Elena kept her expression neutral, though something inside her shifted at the mention of that name. "No, I don't really follow that world anymore. It's been in half the society pages this month," Grace continued. "Julian Ashford and his wife. Apparently it's been falling apart for a while. Very quiet, very civil, according to the reports, but definitely ending." Elena took a sip of her water, giving herself a moment before responding. "I don't know why that would matter to me." Grace raised an eyebrow, studying her sister carefully. "You don't have to pretend it doesn't matter at all. That whole night affected you deeply, whether you like to admit it or not." "It did," Elena admitted, setting down her glass. "But that was 3 years ago. I've built an entire life since then. His marriage ending doesn't change anything about mine." Grace didn't push further, though the conversation lingered in Elena's mind longer than she expected that evening. She told herself it was simply surprise, the strange feeling of hearing news about a person who had once caused her significant pain, now hearing that his own life had taken a difficult turn. She did not feel satisfaction at the news, which surprised her slightly. She had expected, if she ever heard something like this, to feel a small sense of vindication. Instead, she mostly felt nothing at all, or perhaps something closer to distant curiosity, the kind a person feels reading about a stranger's life in a newspaper. She pushed the thought aside and focused on her work, which continued to demand most of her attention. The restaurant project was due to open in 6 weeks, and there were dozens of details still requiring her oversight, from lighting fixtures to furniture placement, to the exact shade of paint for the back wall. She threw herself into the work with the same focus that had carried her through every challenge over the past 3 years, and within a few days, the conversation about Julian Ashford's divorce had faded to the back of her mind. Her studio continued to grow. By the end of that year, Whitmore Design had completed projects across the city, including a boutique hotel lobby that earned Elena her first feature in a regional design publication. The article included a photograph of Elena standing in the finished lobby, arms crossed, a confident smile on her face, looking every bit the successful young entrepreneur she had become. Her parents framed a copy of the article and hung it in their living room, a small but meaningful gesture that told Elena, without words, how far their relationship had come. Elena also began dating occasionally during this period, though nothing serious ever developed. She went out with a few men introduced by friends, enjoyed pleasant enough evenings, but never felt the kind of connection that made her want to pursue anything further. She wondered sometimes whether the bonding ceremony had left a deeper mark on her than she liked to admit, some quiet wariness about being evaluated and found lacking again. But she refused to let that wariness control her life. She simply focused on her work, her friendships, and the slow, steady building of a future she was proud of. One afternoon in late autumn, nearly 4 years after the ceremony, Sophie, her former instructor, and now a close friend and occasional collaborator, invited Elena to speak at the design school, where she had once been a struggling new student. "They want someone who started from nothing and built something real," Sophie explained over coffee. "Someone who didn't inherit a career or a name in the industry. You're the obvious choice." Elena felt a flush of pride at the invitation, along with a flicker of nervousness. Public speaking had never been her strength, and the idea of standing in front of a room full of students, sharing her story, brought back faint echoes of standing in that grand hall 4 years earlier, feeling every eye in the room on her. But this time felt different. This time, she would be standing there on her own terms, sharing a story of her own making, rather than being judged and dismissed by someone else's careless words. She accepted the invitation. The evening of the talk, Elena stood at the front of a lecture hall filled with eager design students, many of them not much younger than she had been when she first walked into that same building, uncertain and starting over. She spoke about her early struggles, about the humiliation that had, in an unexpected way, pushed her toward pursuing the career she had always wanted, but never had the courage to chase. She did not mention the bonding ceremony by name, kept the story vague enough to protect her privacy, but she spoke honestly about the moment that had changed the direction of her life. Sometimes, she told the students, the worst moment of your life turns out to be the beginning of something better, not because the pain itself was good, but because it forced you to stop waiting for someone else's approval and start building something entirely your own. The room applauded warmly when she finished, and several students approached her afterward with questions about her studio, her design philosophy, and how she had managed to build a client base from nothing. Elena answered each question patiently, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over her as she looked out at the room full of young people who saw her not as someone's rejected match, but as a successful designer worth learning from. She left the lecture hall that evening, feeling lighter than she had in years, as though some final piece of the old humiliation had finally loosened its grip on her. She had no idea, walking to her car under the streetlights that night, that across the city, a man was sitting alone in his newly empty house, finally admitting to himself, without any more excuses or distractions to hide behind, exactly how much he needed to find her. The papers finalizing Julian Ashford's divorce arrived on a gray afternoon in early winter, delivered to his office by a courier who had no idea of the weight the envelope carried. Julian signed each page in the places marked by small colored tabs, his handwriting steady, despite the strange numbness spreading through his chest. Charlotte had already signed her copies the week before, in a meeting handled almost entirely by lawyers, with barely a direct conversation passing between them by the end. It had not been a bitter divorce, not in the way these things were sometimes portrayed. There had been no dramatic arguments, no public scandal, no accusations thrown across rooms. Instead, it had been quiet, almost businesslike, two people who had never truly connected, finally admitting that continuing to pretend otherwise served no one. Their families, initially resistant to the idea of dissolving a beneficial business partnership, eventually accepted the separation once it became clear that neither Julian nor Charlotte intended to change their minds. Edward Ashford had not taken the news well at first. He sat Julian down in his study one evening shortly after the announcement, his expression carrying the particular disappointment reserved for moments when his son failed to meet expectations. "Do you understand what this does to the partnership with the Bellamy family?" Edward asked, his voice controlled but sharp. "Years of careful negotiation, and you're willing to throw it away because you're unhappy?" "I'm not throwing anything away," Julian replied, meeting his father's gaze steadily for once, rather than deferring the way he usually did. "The partnership can continue on a business level, without the marriage attached to it. Charlotte and I both agree on that, but staying married to someone I have nothing real with, just to preserve a business arrangement, isn't something I'm willing to keep doing." "Feelings," Edward said, the word carrying obvious disdain, "are a luxury for people who don't understand how the world actually works." "Maybe," Julian said quietly, "or maybe building an entire life around ignoring them is exactly why so many of the marriages in this family look successful on paper and feel empty in every other way." Edward said nothing in response to that, though something in his expression flickered, briefly, before he composed himself again. It was the closest Julian had ever come to directly criticizing the life his father had built, and though neither of them addressed it further that evening, the conversation lingered between them in the weeks that followed, an unspoken tension that had not existed before. After the divorce was finalized, Julian moved out of the large house he had shared with Charlotte and into a smaller apartment closer to the city center. The change felt strange at first, downsizing from a mansion with staff and manicured gardens to a modest apartment where he had to remember to do his own grocery shopping. But there was something clarifying about the smaller space, something that stripped away the excess and left him alone, with his own thoughts in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It was during those first few weeks in the new apartment, sitting alone in the evenings with nothing but silence and the hum of the city outside his window, that Julian finally allowed himself to fully confront the thoughts he had been avoiding for years. He thought about the bonding ceremony more than he had at any point since it happened. He thought about the exact words he had said, the tone of his voice, the way the entire hall had gone silent in the aftermath. He thought about Elena Whitmore's face in that moment, the shock quickly replaced by something steadier, something that had refused to crumble in front of an audience that clearly expected her to. He realized, with growing discomfort, that his marriage to Charlotte had never truly been about Charlotte at all. It had been about proving to himself and to his father that he could make the correct, strategic choice, the choice that looked good on paper and satisfied every external expectation. He had rejected Elena that night, not because of anything about her specifically, but because accepting the match assigned to him felt, in that particular frustrated moment, like one more decision being made for him rather than by him. He had lashed out at the wrong target entirely, and an innocent stranger had paid the price for his frustration with his own life. The guilt he had carried quietly for years finally crystallized into something he could no longer ignore or explain away. He needed to find her. Not to ask for anything from her, not even necessarily forgiveness, but simply to apologize properly, to explain himself as honestly as he could, and to let her know that what he had done that night had nothing to do with her worth as a person, and everything to do with his own unresolved anger at a life he had never truly chosen for himself. He began, cautiously at first, asking questions among mutual acquaintances from the old social circle that had organized the bonding ceremony. Most people barely remembered the incident at all, or remembered it only vaguely, as a minor scandal from years earlier. No one seemed to know what had become of Elena Whitmore after that night. Her family, it turned out, had grown quieter over the years, less visible in the social circles that had once been so central to their lives. Julian reached out to Laura, the matchmaker who had presided over that fateful ceremony, hoping she might have some record of Elena's whereabouts. Laura agreed to meet him at a small cafe near her office, though her expression when she arrived suggested she was not entirely pleased to see him. "I remember you," Laura said, settling into the chair across from him without much warmth. "And I remember what you did to that young woman." "I know," Julian said. "I've thought about it for years. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm trying to find her, to apologize properly." Laura studied him for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether his intentions were genuine or simply another example of privileged carelessness. "Why now? It's been years." "Because it took me this long to stop lying to myself about why I did it," Julian admitted. "And because I recently ended a marriage that never should have happened in the first place. And going through that made me realize how much damage gets done when people make important decisions about other people's lives, without any real thought behind them." Something in his tone seemed to soften Laura's guarded expression slightly. She was quiet for a moment before responding. "I don't have current information about her. She stopped attending any of our events years ago, cut ties with that entire world as far as I know. Her family doesn't discuss her much publicly anymore, at least not in the circles I still move in. Do you know anything at all? Anything that might help me find her?" Laura hesitated, weighing her next words carefully. "I heard secondhand that she pursued some kind of design career. Interior design, I believe. Beyond that, I genuinely don't know. And even if I did know more, I'm not certain I would simply hand that information over without knowing her side of things first. She deserved better than what happened that night, and if she has managed to build a peaceful life away from all of this, I wouldn't want to be responsible for disrupting that without her consent." Julian nodded, understanding the caution behind Laura's words, even as it frustrated him. "I respect that, but if you happen to hear anything, or if you're willing to reach out to her on my behalf at some point, I'd be grateful." Laura made no promises that day, though she did not entirely dismiss the request either. Julian left the cafe with only a small piece of information, a career path rather than a name or address, but it was more than he had before, and he clung to it with a determination that surprised even himself. Over the following months, Julian began quietly searching for any interior design studios in the city that might have been founded or run by a woman named Elena Whitmore. He hired a private researcher initially, someone experienced in discreet background searches, but stopped the search after only a few weeks, feeling uncomfortable with the idea of investigating her like a stranger, to be located and catalogued, rather than a person he genuinely wanted to make amends with. Instead, he began attending design exhibitions and industry events himself, scanning name tags and portfolio displays, feeling increasingly foolish each time he came up empty. His father, unaware of the personal search consuming much of Julian's free time, grew increasingly frustrated by what he perceived as his son's distraction from the family business. Julian, for his part, continued fulfilling his professional responsibilities competently, but the singular focus he had once brought to expanding the family's holdings had shifted, quietly but unmistakably, toward this personal search that mattered more to him than any business deal. Nearly a year after his divorce, Julian attended a business dinner hosted by a colleague expanding into hospitality development. The conversation, as it often did in those circles, eventually turned toward recent projects transforming the city's commercial districts. Someone mentioned, almost in passing, a small but highly regarded design studio responsible for several recent restaurant renovations that had received significant local attention. Whitmore Design, the colleague said, glancing at notes on his phone. Small studio, but the work is excellent. Apparently the founder started from nothing just a few years ago. Julian's entire body went still. He asked, as casually as he could manage despite his racing heartbeat, for more details. The colleague knew little beyond the studio's name and its growing reputation, but it was enough. It was more than enough. That night, alone in his apartment, Julian searched for Whitmore Design online for the first time. He found a modest but professionally designed website, featuring photographs of warm, thoughtfully arranged interior spaces, restaurants and shops and small hotels, transformed by careful attention to light, texture and color. And there, on the About page, was a photograph of Elena Whitmore, older than he remembered, more confident in her posture, standing in front of one of her completed projects with a quiet, self-assured smile. Julian sat staring at the screen for a long time, feeling a complicated mixture of relief, guilt, and something else he wasn't quite ready to name. He had found her. Now he simply had to figure out how to approach her, without causing further harm to a life she had clearly built with tremendous effort, entirely without him, entirely because of what he had once so carelessly taken from her. Julian spent nearly 2 weeks simply staring at the Whitmore Design website before he worked up the courage to take any real action. He read through every project description, studied every photograph, and found himself, more than once, admiring the work itself, independent of any connection to Elena. She had built something genuinely impressive, spaces that felt inviting and carefully considered, a clear signature style emerging across each project, despite their different purposes and budgets. He knew he could not simply show up at her studio and announce himself. After everything he had put her through, arriving unannounced would likely feel like another intrusion, another moment where he inserted himself into her life without permission or warning. He needed a way to approach her that gave her the choice of whether to engage with him at all. His friend Oliver, who had known Julian since university and remained one of the few people aware of the personal search he had been conducting quietly for months, offered a suggestion one evening over drinks. "Why not approach her as a client first?" Oliver said. "Not deceptively, exactly, but request a consultation like anyone else would. It gives her control over the interaction. She can accept or decline a business meeting without feeling ambushed, the way she might if you just showed up claiming to want to apologize." Julian considered the idea carefully. There was something appealing about it, a way to initiate contact that respected the boundaries Elena had clearly built around her new life, while still creating an opportunity for him to finally say what he had been wanting to say for years. "I don't want to lie to her," Julian said, even indirectly. "If I request a consultation under false pretenses, that's just another way of not being honest with her." "Then don't lie," Oliver said simply. "You do actually have a property that could use some design work, don't you? The apartment you moved into after the divorce is barely furnished. Request a legitimate consultation. If she recognizes your name and doesn't want to take the meeting, she can simply decline. If she agrees to meet, at least you'll have the chance to explain yourself in person, in a setting that isn't overwhelming or confrontational." Julian turned the idea over for several more days before finally deciding to act on it. He composed a message to Whitmore Design's general business inquiry line, requesting a consultation for his apartment, providing his full name honestly, without any attempt to disguise who he was. If Elena saw the request and recognized his name, she would have every right to refuse the meeting entirely, and Julian told himself he would accept that outcome gracefully, however disappointing it might feel. The message sat unanswered for nearly a week, long enough that Julian began to assume Elena had seen his name and chosen to ignore the request entirely, a response he understood completely, even as it disappointed him. But on the 8th day, a reply arrived from the studio's general assistant, confirming a consultation appointment for the following Tuesday afternoon. Julian read the confirmation email 3 times, trying to determine whether Elena herself had approved the appointment, or whether it had simply been scheduled by an assistant without her direct knowledge, unaware of the history between them. He had no way of knowing for certain, and the uncertainty sat heavily with him over the following days as he prepared, as best he could, for whatever awaited him at that meeting. He arrived at the Whitmore Design Studio on Tuesday afternoon nearly 15 minutes early, unable to sit still in his apartment any longer, unwilling to risk being late for a meeting that felt more significant than any business negotiation he had ever prepared for. The studio occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse building, with large windows displaying framed photographs of completed projects, and a small reception area furnished simply but thoughtfully. A young receptionist greeted him warmly, checking his name against the appointment schedule and asking him to have a seat while she let the design team know he had arrived. Julian sat in a comfortable chair near the window, his hands clasped tightly together, watching the door that presumably led back to the studio's working spaces, waiting for whoever would emerge to greet him. When the door finally opened, it was Nathan, Elena's assistant designer, who stepped out first, holding a tablet and glancing between his notes and Julian with polite professional interest. "Mr. Ashford? I'm Nathan. I'll be assisting with your consultation today. Elena will be joining us shortly. She's just finishing up a call." Julian's chest tightened at the confirmation that Elena herself would indeed be present, that this was not simply going to be a meeting handled entirely by her staff while she remained safely absent. He nodded, managing a polite response to Nathan's questions about the apartment he wanted redesigned, though his attention remained fixed on the door behind the reception area, watching for any sign of Elena's arrival. Several minutes passed before the door opened again, and Elena Whitmore walked into the reception area, glancing down at a folder in her hands, before lifting her eyes toward her new client. The moment she saw his face, everything in her expression changed. Julian watched, with a mixture of dread and resignation, as recognition flickered across her features, followed quickly by something harder, more guarded. The professional warmth she had walked in with, replaced almost instantly by careful, controlled distance. She stopped walking for a brief moment, just long enough for Julian to see the flash of shock and old hurt cross her face, before she composed herself and continued forward. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice level, though there was an unmistakable edge beneath the professional courtesy. "I wasn't aware you were the client on today's schedule until just now." "I'm sorry," Julian said immediately, standing from his chair. "I should have been clearer in the initial request. I didn't want to ambush you, but I also didn't know how else to reach out to you after all this time." Nathan, sensing the sudden tension in the room, glanced between the two of them with obvious confusion, clearly aware that something significant was happening, but unsure of the details. Elena's jaw tightened slightly as she processed the situation, her eyes never leaving Julian's face. Several long seconds passed in silence, the reception area suddenly feeling much smaller than it had a moment before. "Nathan," Elena finally said, her voice steady despite the tension evident in her posture. "Could you give us a few minutes alone, please?" Nathan nodded quickly, clearly relieved to be excused from whatever conversation was about to unfold, and retreated back through the studio door, leaving Julian and Elena alone in the small reception area for the first time in nearly 4 years. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Elena studied him carefully, as though trying to determine what exactly he wanted from this encounter, what game he might be playing by showing up at her place of business, under the guise of a legitimate client inquiry. "Why are you here, Julian?" she finally asked, her voice quiet but firm. "And I want the real answer, not whatever careful explanation you've prepared." Julian took a steadying breath, aware that whatever he said in the next few moments would likely determine whether this conversation continued at all, or whether Elena would simply ask him to leave and never contact her studio again. "I do need design work done," he said honestly. "That part is true, but that's not why I'm really here. I've spent years trying to find you, not to disrupt your life or ask anything of you, but because I've never forgiven myself for what I did that night at the bonding ceremony, and I needed the chance to tell you that directly, if you'll allow it." Elena's expression remained guarded, though something in her posture shifted slightly, some small crack in the professional armor she had put on, the moment she recognized him. "4 years is a long time to carry an apology you never delivered," she said. "I know," Julian admitted. "I should have found you sooner. I told myself for a long time, that reaching out would only cause more disruption, that you were better off without me appearing in your life again. It took me longer than it should have to realize that not apologizing at all was its own kind of cowardice. Elena crossed her arms, studying him with an expression Julian couldn't quite read, somewhere between skepticism and cautious consideration. I don't need your apology to be happy, Julian. I built an entire life without it, a good life. I can see that, Julian said, gesturing toward the studio around them, toward the framed photographs of her completed projects, visible through the reception area's glass walls. It's clear you didn't need anything from me to succeed. That's exactly why I need you to know that what I said that night had nothing to do with you, and everything to do with my own anger at a life I felt trapped inside of. You didn't deserve what I did. No one deserves that. Elena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes moving briefly to the framed photographs Julian had gestured toward, as though drawing strength from the evidence of everything she had built since that painful night. When she finally spoke again, her voice had softened slightly, though the guardedness remained. I appreciate you saying that, she said carefully, but an apology after 4 years doesn't erase what happened, and it definitely doesn't mean I owe you trust, just because you finally decided to explain yourself. I'm not asking for trust, Julian said quickly. I'm not asking for anything, actually, beyond the chance to say I'm sorry, properly, and to let you decide what happens after that, if anything. Elena studied him for another long moment, weighing his words carefully. Finally, she let out a slow breath and glanced toward the studio door behind her, where Nathan had disappeared moments before. The apartment consultation, she said. Was any part of that real, or was it entirely a way to get in front of me? It's real, Julian confirmed. I genuinely need design help, but I understand completely if you'd rather have someone else on your team handle it, or if you'd rather I find a different studio altogether. I won't be offended, and I won't try to contact you again if that's what you decide. Elena considered this for a moment longer, then finally nodded slowly, though her expression remained careful, unreadable. Nathan can handle the actual design work, but I think, given everything, you and I should talk properly first. Not here, not in the middle of a business consultation with my assistant listening in. Somewhere we can speak honestly, without an audience this time. Julian felt something loosen slightly in his chest, a small measure of relief that she was willing to continue the conversation at all, even cautiously, even without any promise of forgiveness attached. Anywhere you're comfortable, he said, whenever works for you. Elena glanced at her watch, then back at him, her expression finally softening just slightly at the edges. There's a cafe 2 blocks from here. I can meet you there in 20 minutes, once I've finished handing off the rest of my schedule today. Julian nodded, gratitude evident in his expression despite his effort to remain composed. Thank you, Elena, I mean that. Elena said nothing further, simply turned and walked back through the studio door, leaving Julian standing alone in the reception area, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty about what the conversation ahead might reveal. For the first time in 4 years, the two of them were about to speak honestly, without an audience, without the weight of a public ceremony hanging over every word. Whatever came next, Julian understood clearly that it would be entirely Elena's choice to make. The cafe Elena had chosen sat on a quiet corner, 2 streets from her studio, a small independent place with mismatched chairs and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the counter near the entrance. Julian arrived first, choosing a table near the back, where the noise of the street outside wouldn't interfere with whatever conversation was about to unfold. He ordered nothing, unwilling to occupy himself with a cup he had no intention of drinking, his attention fixed entirely on the door. Elena arrived exactly on time, her coat still on, her expression composed but watchful as she crossed the small room and took the seat across from him. She ordered tea from the waiter, who approached briefly, then folded her hands on the table and looked at Julian directly, waiting. I want to start by saying I don't expect anything from this conversation, Julian said, choosing his words carefully. I'm not here hoping you'll suddenly forgive me, or that we'll walk out of this cafe as though the last 4 years didn't happen. I just need you to understand what actually happened that night, because I don't think you ever got the real explanation, and you deserved one. Elena's expression remained steady, though her eyes narrowed slightly. Go on. Julian took a slow breath, gathering his thoughts before continuing. That morning, before the ceremony, I had a difficult conversation with my father about the direction of the family business. He'd been making decisions on my behalf for years, decisions about my education, my career path, even decisions about which social circles I should maintain. By the time I arrived at the ceremony that evening, I already felt like my entire life had been decided by someone else, and I hadn't had any real say in any of it. That still doesn't explain why you humiliated a stranger in front of hundreds of people, Elena said, her voice quiet but firm. No, Julian agreed. It doesn't. There's no explanation that makes what I did acceptable. I'm not trying to justify it. I'm trying to explain the state of mind I was in, because I think it matters that you understand it had absolutely nothing to do with you personally. When Laura called your name and we were matched, something in me reacted against the entire process itself, against feeling like my future wife had simply been assigned to me, the same way meetings got added to my calendar. I said the cruelest thing I could think of in that moment. Not because of anything about you, but because I wanted, somewhere in my frustrated mind, to reject the process itself. You were simply standing there when that anger came out. Elena was quiet for a long moment, absorbing his words. The waiter returned briefly with her tea, and she wrapped her hands around the warm cup without drinking, her eyes still fixed on Julian. Do you understand what that did to me? She finally asked. Standing in front of everyone I knew, everyone my family knew, being told in that tone, in front of that many people, that I wasn't what someone pictured. I didn't just lose a match that night. I lost my sense of safety in front of an entire room of people I would have to face again and again for years. I know, Julian said quietly. I've thought about that moment more times than I can count. I've imagined what it must have felt like from your side, and every time, it makes me feel sick with how careless I was. You didn't just embarrass me, Elena continued, her voice gaining a slight edge now, years of buried frustration finally finding an outlet. You made a decision about my worth in 3 seconds, without knowing anything real about me, and you did it in the most public, humiliating way possible. Do you know what people said about me afterward? Do you know how many months it took before people stopped bringing it up at every family gathering? Julian shook his head slowly. I don't know the details of what happened to you after that night. I only know what happened to me, and it doesn't come close to comparing. No, Elena said, it doesn't. She paused, taking a breath, some of the sharp edge in her voice softening slightly, though the firmness remained. I walked away from that ceremony, and I built an entire new life because of what happened. I don't regret where I ended up. My studio, my work, the person I've become because of pushing through that humiliation instead of letting it define me. I'm proud of that. But that doesn't mean what you did was acceptable, or that I owe you easy forgiveness just because you finally showed up with an apology years later. I'm not asking for easy forgiveness, Julian said. I don't think I deserve that, honestly. I just needed you to know that I understand, now, how much damage careless words can do when they come from someone who has power in a situation and doesn't think about how they're using it. I spent years building a life that looked successful from the outside and felt completely hollow underneath, married to someone I barely connected with, working for a father who valued strategic decisions over genuine happiness. And through all of that, the moment that kept coming back to me, the moment I couldn't stop thinking about, was you walking out of that hall with more dignity than I had shown in the entire evening. Elena studied him carefully, something in her expression shifting slightly, though she remained guarded. Why does that moment matter so much to you? Plenty of people have probably experienced far worse public embarrassments and moved on without you thinking twice about them. Julian considered the question seriously before answering. Because it was the first time I saw someone refuse to be diminished by cruelty they didn't deserve. You didn't argue. You didn't beg. You didn't make a scene trying to salvage the situation. You simply decided you weren't going to stay somewhere you weren't valued, and you left. I think some part of me recognized, even in that moment, that I had just witnessed real strength, and it unsettled me because I knew I didn't have that same strength in my own life. I was staying in situations I didn't want, making choices that weren't mine, simply because it was easier than confronting my father or challenging the life that had been mapped out for me. Elena's expression softened further, though she still held herself carefully, unwilling to fully let her guard down. That's a lot to project onto a single moment with a stranger. Maybe, Julian admitted, but it's honest. I've had years to think about it, and that's the truest explanation I can give you. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe continuing around them, unaware of the significance of the conversation happening at the small table near the back. Elena finally took a sip of her tea, considering everything Julian had said, weighing it against the years of hurt she had carried, however successfully she had managed to build a life around it. "I appreciate you finally explaining yourself," she said eventually. "And I believe that you mean this apology genuinely. But I want to be clear about something. I didn't spend the last 4 years waiting for you to show up and make things right. I built this life for myself, entirely without you, and I'm not going to pretend that your apology suddenly fixes everything, or that we can simply move forward as though nothing happened." "I don't expect that," Julian said quickly. "I would never expect that." "Good," Elena said. "Because if there's ever going to be anything between us beyond this conversation, even just a professional relationship around the design work you actually need done, it has to be built slowly, and it has to be built on you proving, through your actions, that you're actually the person you're describing right now, and not simply someone caught up in a moment of guilt that will fade the next time your father needs something from you." Julian nodded, understanding the weight of what she was asking, understanding that words alone, however honest, would never be enough to repair what he had broken that night. "I understand, and I'm willing to prove that, however long it takes, without expecting anything in return." Elena studied him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her eyes. Finally, she nodded slowly, setting her cup down on the table. "Nathan will handle your design consultation," she said. "He's talented, and he'll do good work for you. Beyond that, I'm not promising anything more than this conversation, but I appreciate you finding me, and I appreciate the honesty." She stood from the table, gathering her coat around her shoulders, and Julian rose as well, understanding that the meeting was drawing to its natural end, at least for now. "Thank you for hearing me out," he said. "I know you didn't owe me that." Elena paused for a moment before turning toward the door, glancing back at him one final time. "No," she agreed quietly. "I didn't. But I think some part of me needed to hear it too, even if I'm still deciding what to do with it." She left the cafe without another word, and Julian sat back down slowly, watching through the window as she walked down the street and disappeared around the corner, carrying with her the first real conversation they had ever had, 4 years after the moment that had changed both their lives so completely. It was not forgiveness. It was not even close to reconciliation, but it was, Julian understood clearly, a beginning, however fragile, and he intended to honor it by proving, through consistent action rather than words alone, that the man standing in that cafe was someone worth Elena's continued attention, even if it took years to earn back the trust he had so carelessly destroyed in a single careless moment. Nathan handled the apartment consultation exactly as promised, meeting Julian at his residence the following week to discuss layout, furniture, and overall design direction. The sessions were professional and straightforward, and Julian made a point of never using them as an excuse to see Elena, never asking Nathan questions about her personal life, or trying to steer conversations back toward the woman he had spent years searching for. He understood, clearly, that pushing too hard now would undo whatever fragile opening their cafe conversation had created. Instead, Julian focused on being patient in a way that felt unfamiliar to him, accustomed as he was to solving problems quickly and decisively in his business dealings. He allowed weeks to pass without contacting Elena directly, giving her the space she had implicitly asked for, though the waiting tested a kind of restraint he had rarely needed to practice in his life. When the apartment project neared completion, Julian requested, through Nathan, a final walkthrough with the full design team, a standard practice for the studio's completed projects. Elena arrived alongside Nathan for that final visit, professional and composed, walking through the finished space with a critical eye, checking details against the original design plans. "The lighting in the living area works better than I expected," she commented to Nathan, though Julian, standing nearby, understood the comment was meant as genuine professional feedback rather than any opening for personal conversation. "Nathan did excellent work," Julian offered, careful to keep his tone appropriately professional. "The space feels like an actual home now, rather than just a place I sleep." Elena glanced at him briefly, something flickering behind her eyes that Julian couldn't quite identify, before she returned her attention to the room. "I'm glad you're happy with it." The walkthrough concluded without any further personal exchange, and Julian thanked both Elena and Nathan for their work before they left, resisting the urge to ask if he might see her again, outside of a strictly professional context. He understood that any further contact needed to come from her, if it came at all. Weeks passed. Julian continued his work at the family company, though he found himself, increasingly, making small changes to how he approached his responsibilities there. He began pushing back gently against some of his father's more rigid business decisions, advocating for projects that prioritized long-term community benefit alongside profit, a shift in perspective that Edward found puzzling at first, though he did not entirely dismiss it. "You've changed since the divorce," Edward observed one evening, during one of their infrequent dinners together. "I'm not certain if it's for better or worse yet." "Better," Julian said simply. "I spent a long time making decisions based on what looked correct, rather than what actually mattered. I'd rather build something real now, even if it takes longer, or looks less impressive on paper." Edward studied his son for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to this new version of Julian, one who spoke with quiet conviction, rather than deferring automatically to established family strategy. He said nothing further on the matter that evening, but the conversation planted a seed that would, over the following months, gradually soften some of the rigid expectations Edward had long held for his son's future. Meanwhile, Elena continued running her studio, her days filled with client meetings, site visits, and the steady stream of projects that kept Whitmore Design consistently busy. She thought about Julian more than she expected to in the weeks following their cafe conversation, though she kept those thoughts carefully compartmentalized, unwilling to let old wounds resurface, simply because he had finally offered an explanation for the pain he had caused. Grace noticed the change in her sister during one of their regular dinners, though Elena had not mentioned Julian's reappearance in her life directly. "You seem distracted lately," Grace observed, studying Elena across the table. "More than usual, I mean. Is something going on with the studio?" Elena hesitated before answering, deciding finally to share the truth with the one person she trusted completely. "Julian Ashford found me. He came in as a client a few weeks ago, and we talked properly for the first time since the ceremony." Grace's eyebrows rose in surprise. "And? How did that go?" "He apologized," Elena said carefully. "Genuinely, I think. He explained what was actually happening in his life at the time, why he reacted the way he did. It didn't excuse anything, but it did help me understand it wasn't really about me at all." "How do you feel about it?" Grace asked. Elena considered the question honestly before answering. "I don't know yet. Part of me wants to keep him at a distance entirely, to protect the life I built without him in it. But part of me is curious whether the person who apologized to me in that cafe is actually who he says he is, or whether it was just guilt talking, something that will fade once he feels sufficiently forgiven. Only time will tell you that," Grace said gently. "But for what it's worth, you don't owe him anything, regardless of how genuine his apology turns out to be. Whatever you decide, decide it because it's right for you, not because you feel obligated to give him a chance, simply because he showed up eventually." Elena nodded, appreciating her sister's perspective, though the words did little to fully settle the uncertainty still lingering in her mind. Over the following months, Julian found small, appropriate ways to remain present in Elena's orbit, without ever overstepping the careful boundaries established during their cafe conversation. He recommended Whitmore Design to business associates looking for renovation work, never mentioning his personal history with the studio, simply praising the quality of the work he had personally experienced. He attended a design exhibition where several of Elena's projects were featured, standing respectfully at a distance, offering a brief, genuine compliment on her work, before leaving without pushing for further conversation. Elena noticed these small gestures, each one a quiet demonstration of respect, rather than any attempt to force his way back into her personal life. Slowly, almost without realizing it was happening, her guardedness began to soften slightly, replaced by a cautious curiosity about the man Julian was gradually revealing himself to be, so different from the careless stranger who had humiliated her in front of hundreds of people all those years ago. Nearly 6 months after their cafe conversation, Elena found herself, almost involuntarily, thinking about Julian with something other than guarded wariness. She caught herself wondering how his work at the family company was progressing, whether the changes Grace had heard rumors about, softer business decisions, greater community focus, were genuine reflections of personal growth, or simply strategic public relations moves. She decided, finally, that the only way to know for certain was to allow herself one more conversation, on her own terms this time, without the pressure of an unexpected reunion, or the weight of an overdue apology hanging over every word. She reached out to Julian directly for the first time, sending a brief message asking if he would be willing to meet again, simply to talk, without any business pretense attached this time. Julian responded within minutes, agreeing immediately, careful not to express too much eagerness in his reply, though the excitement he felt reading her message was undeniable. They agreed to meet the following weekend, at a small park near Elena's studio, neutral ground that belonged to neither of their established lives, a fitting setting for whatever new chapter might be beginning between them. The park was quiet. On the Saturday morning Elena and Julian met, only a handful of people scattered across the paths, walking dogs or jogging along the tree-lined trail that circled a small pond near the center. Julian arrived early again, a habit he seemed unable to break whenever it came to meeting Elena, and he stood near a wooden bench overlooking the water, watching the ducks glide across the still surface while he waited. Elena arrived a few minutes later, dressed casually, in a way Julian had never seen her before, comfortable rather than professionally composed, and something about the sight of her approaching along the path, relaxed and unguarded, made his chest tighten with a feeling he was only beginning to allow himself to name. "Thank you for reaching out," Julian said, as she settled onto the bench beside him, leaving a comfortable distance between them. "I wanted to see if the person from that cafe conversation was consistent," Elena said honestly. "Not just words spoken in a single difficult moment, but someone who actually follows through. And what have you found so far?" Julian asked, genuinely curious about her assessment. Elena considered the question carefully before answering. "You've been respectful. You haven't pushed, haven't tried to insert yourself into my life beyond what I've allowed. That matters more than you probably realize." They talked for nearly 2 hours that morning, covering subjects far beyond the weight of their shared history. Julian asked about her studio, genuinely curious about her design philosophy, and Elena found herself explaining, with growing enthusiasm, the principles that guided her work, the belief that spaces should feel warm and lived in, rather than simply impressive to look at. Julian listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions that revealed genuine interest, rather than polite obligation. In turn, Elena asked about the changes Julian had been making at the family company, and he spoke honestly about the difficult conversations with his father, the slow process of carving out space for his own values, within a business built entirely around his father's rigid strategic thinking. He admitted, too, how much the divorce had taught him about the danger of building a life around decisions made for the sake of appearances, rather than genuine conviction. By the time they parted that afternoon, both of them understood, without needing to say it directly, that this had been more than a simple follow-up conversation. Something had shifted between them, cautious and tentative, but undeniably real. Over the following months, Julian and Elena continued meeting, gradually and carefully, allowing their relationship to develop at a pace that respected the significant history between them. They met for coffee, for walks in the park, for quiet dinners at restaurants far from the social circles that had once dictated so much of both their lives. Elena remained cautious throughout, unwilling to fully release her guard, but with each passing month, she found herself trusting Julian a little more, watching him remain consistent, patient, and genuinely respectful of the boundaries she had established. Grace, initially skeptical of the entire situation, gradually softened her own concerns as she watched her sister grow steadily happier over the following months, without any sign of losing the independence and confidence she had worked so hard to build. "I still don't fully trust him," Grace admitted one evening, several months into Elena and Julian's renewed connection. "But I trust you to know your own boundaries, and I have to admit, you seem happy in a way I haven't seen in years." "I am happy," Elena said, somewhat surprised by how easily the admission came. "Not because of him specifically, but because I finally feel like I understand what happened that night, and because he's shown me, consistently, that he's actually working to become someone different from the person who hurt me back then." Not everyone in Julian's life responded as warmly to the relationship's development. Edward Ashford, upon learning that his son had reconnected with the woman he had publicly rejected years earlier, expressed clear disapproval during a tense dinner conversation. "Do you understand how this looks?" Edward asked, his voice sharp with frustration. "Reuniting with a woman you humiliated, in front of half the city's social elite? People will talk. It undermines everything we've worked to build." "People already talked plenty when I divorced Charlotte," Julian replied evenly, no longer intimidated by his father's disapproval, the way he once had been. "And honestly, I've stopped caring as much about what people say. Elena is someone I deeply respect, someone who built an incredible life entirely on her own after I treated her terribly. If people want to gossip about that, they're welcome to. I'm not going to let their opinions dictate my choices anymore." Edward stared at his son for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to this level of quiet defiance. "You've changed significantly since the divorce." "I have," Julian agreed. "And honestly, I think it's for the better, even if it doesn't align with everything you originally wanted for me." The conversation did not end in full reconciliation between father and son, but it marked a clear turning point, a moment where Julian firmly established that his life, moving forward, would be built according to his own values rather than his father's rigid expectations. Elena, for her part, faced her own moments of doubt throughout the developing relationship. There were nights when old memories resurfaced unexpectedly, the humiliation of that ceremony rising up despite the progress she had made in trusting Julian again. During one such evening, several months into their renewed connection, she found herself unable to shake a wave of old anxiety after attending a social event where several attendees recognized both of them and began whispering behind cupped hands, clearly recalling the story from years earlier. "I thought I was past this," Elena admitted to Julian later that evening, sitting on the small balcony of her apartment, staring out at the city lights. "I thought I'd built enough of a life that it wouldn't bother me anymore. People staring, people whispering about what happened." Julian sat beside her, careful to give her space while still offering quiet support. "You don't have to be past it entirely for it to still hurt sometimes. That kind of humiliation doesn't just disappear because time has passed. I understand, if seeing me brings some of that back, even now." "It's not just about you," Elena admitted. "It's about how much power that single moment still has over me, even after everything I've accomplished since then. I hate that it can still make me feel small, even for a few minutes." "For what it's worth," Julian said gently, "the people whispering tonight don't know anything real about you. They don't know about the studio you built from nothing, the reputation you've earned entirely through your own talent and effort. They only know a rumor from years ago, frozen in time, completely disconnected from who you actually are now. Their opinions don't define you, any more than mine did that night." Elena considered his words for a long moment, something in her chest loosening slightly at the genuine understanding behind them. "You've gotten better at saying the right thing at the right time," she said, a small, reluctant smile finally breaking through her earlier tension. "I've had a lot of practice apologizing for getting it wrong," Julian said, returning her smile carefully. "I figured it was time to start getting some things right instead." Their relationship continued to deepen over the following months, built slowly and deliberately on a foundation of genuine understanding, rather than the careless assumptions that had defined their first, disastrous encounter. Elena introduced Julian to her parents cautiously, watching closely for any sign of the careless arrogance that had once defined him. Henry remained skeptical initially, protective of his daughter after everything she had endured, but gradually warmed as he observed Julian's genuine respect for Elena's independence and achievements. Diane, surprisingly, proved more forgiving than Henry, perhaps still holding on to some of her original hope that Elena would eventually find a stable, socially prominent match, though she was careful never to voice that hope directly, respecting how far Elena had come in building a life entirely on her own terms. By the time nearly a year had passed since their reunion in Elena's studio reception area, both Elena and Julian understood that what had grown between them was no longer simply an apology being slowly accepted, but something genuinely new, built on mutual respect, patience, and a shared understanding of what it meant to grow beyond the mistakes and limitations of who they had once been. Neither of them rushed toward any grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Instead, they continued building their relationship steadily, month after month, each demonstrating through consistent action, rather than empty words, that they had both changed fundamentally, from the two people who had stood across from each other in that grand hall so many years before. It was during a quiet dinner one evening, nearly 18 months after their reunion, that Julian finally raised the subject that had been growing steadily in his mind for months. "I know how this might sound," he said carefully, "given everything that happened between us. But I've been thinking about the future, about what I actually want it to look like. And every version of that future I imagine includes you." Elena studied him carefully across the table, her expression thoughtful rather than surprised, as though she too had been considering similar thoughts for some time. "What exactly are you asking?" "Nothing right now," Julian said quickly. "I'm not asking for any commitment tonight. I just wanted you to know where my mind has been, honestly, without hiding it, or waiting for some perfect moment to bring it up. Whatever happens next, I want it to be something you choose freely, on your own terms, the way everything in your life has been since that night you walked out of the ceremony." Elena reached across the table, resting her hand gently over his for the first time in their renewed relationship, a small but significant gesture that spoke more clearly than any words could have. "I think," she said softly, "I'm starting to imagine that future too." 5 years to the day after the bonding ceremony that had once humiliated her in front of hundreds of strangers, Elena Whitmore stood once again in a grand hall filled with soft golden light, though this time, everything about the moment felt entirely different. This was not a matchmaking ceremony organized by families seeking strategic alliances. This was an event Elena had chosen herself, planned according to her own wishes, surrounded by people she had personally invited because they mattered to her, not because tradition or family obligation demanded their presence. The hall, ironically, was the very same venue where the original ceremony had taken place years earlier, a detail Elena had chosen deliberately, wanting to reclaim the space that had once held such painful memories and transform it into something entirely new. She wore a dress of deep emerald green this time, nothing like the cautious blue she had worn all those years ago, chosen specifically because it made her feel powerful rather than small. Her hair was styled the way she liked it, not according to anyone else's expectations, and as she stood near the entrance of the hall, waiting for the moment to begin, she felt none of the anxious uncertainty that had gripped her 5 years earlier. Grace stood beside her, adjusting the small bouquet in Elena's hands, her eyes slightly misty despite her best efforts to remain composed. "Can you believe this is the same room?" she asked quietly. "I wanted it to be," Elena said, glancing around at the familiar space, transformed now, with different flowers, different lighting, a different energy entirely. "I needed to know that I could walk back into this hall and leave it feeling completely different than I did the first time." Across the room, Julian stood near the front, dressed simply but elegantly, watching the entrance with an expression that held none of the detached boredom he had worn 5 years earlier. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, a small betrayal of nerves despite his outward composure, and beside him stood Oliver, serving as his closest support for the day, along with a noticeably more relaxed Edward Ashford, who had, over the past several years, gradually come to accept and even genuinely welcome the relationship his son had built with Elena. The transformation in Edward had not happened quickly or easily. It had taken years of watching Julian make consistent, principled choices, watching the family business thrive, under a leadership style that balanced strategic thinking with genuine care for the people it affected, and watching his son build a life with a woman who had never once compromised her own values or independence to fit into the Ashford family's expectations. Slowly, reluctantly, and then with growing genuine warmth, Edward had come to respect Elena entirely on her own terms, understanding finally that the strength she carried was exactly the kind of quality he should have valued in his own life decades earlier. Henry and Diane sat near the front of the gathered guests, watching with quiet pride as the moment approached. Henry, in particular, had grown close to Julian over the preceding years, their relationship built slowly, through shared conversations about business, about family, about the kind of legacy each of them hoped to leave behind. He no longer harbored any doubt about Julian's genuine character, having watched him prove himself, repeatedly, patiently, without ever demanding trust before earning it. Sophie, Nathan, and the rest of Elena's design team sat together near the middle of the hall, along with several of the studio's longtime clients who had become genuine friends over the years, evidence of the community Elena had built entirely through her own talent and dedication. As the music began to play, signaling the ceremony's true start. Elena took a slow, steadying breath, though the nervousness she felt now was nothing like the anxious dread of 5 years earlier. This time, she walked forward not because tradition demanded it, not because a matchmaker had assigned her a fate to accept or reject, but because she had chosen, entirely on her own terms, to walk toward the man waiting for her at the front of the hall. Julian watched her approach, his expression open and unguarded in a way that would have been impossible for the careless, frustrated young man he had once been. He remembered, with painful clarity, the 3 seconds 5 years earlier, when he had glanced at this same woman and dismissed her without a second thought, without any understanding of the strength, talent, and genuine warmth that defined who she truly was. He understood now, more deeply than he ever had before, exactly what he had almost lost that night, and exactly how much work it had taken to earn his way back into her life, not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through years of patient, consistent proof that he had genuinely changed. When Elena reached the front of the hall, she looked up at him, her eyes steady and clear, none of the uncertainty that had once defined their first encounter remaining anywhere in her expression. "Last time we stood in this room," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear, "you looked at me for 3 seconds and decided I wasn't what you wanted." "I know," Julian said softly, his voice carrying genuine remorse, even now, even after everything they had built together. "It's the worst decision I've ever made, and I've spent 5 years trying to become someone worthy of a second chance I never should have needed in the first place." "You did become that person," Elena said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. "Not because I needed you to prove anything to me, but because you chose to grow into someone better, regardless of whether I ever gave you the chance to show me." The ceremony that followed was simple, personal, and entirely unlike the rigid tradition that had once governed their first encounter. There was no matchmaker reading formal declarations, no family representatives negotiating terms on their behalf. Instead, Elena and Julian spoke their own words, chosen carefully over the preceding months, honest reflections of everything they had learned about themselves and each other throughout their long, difficult journey back to this room. "I spent 5 years building a life that didn't depend on anyone choosing me," Elena said, addressing the gathered guests as much as she addressed Julian directly. "I built my career, my independence, my sense of self-worth, entirely on my own terms, without waiting for anyone's approval. And I want to be clear, standing here today, that I'm not choosing Julian because I need him to complete something that was missing in my life. I'm choosing him because, after everything, he proved himself to be someone genuinely worth building a shared future with, someone who respects the life I built without him, just as much as he values the life we're building together now." Julian, when it came his turn to speak, kept his words equally honest, equally free from the polished, strategic language that had once defined so much of his public life. "5 years ago, in this very room, I made a decision based on frustration and cowardice, dismissing someone I didn't even know, because it felt easier than confronting my own unhappiness. I spent years afterward trying to become someone who deserved a second chance, not because I expected to receive one, but because I needed to become better, regardless of the outcome. Elena taught me, without ever intending to, what real strength looks like, what genuine independence looks like, and what it means to build a life around values, rather than appearances. I don't take this moment for granted, not for a single second, and I promise to spend every day proving that the trust she's placed in me was worth the years it took to earn." As the ceremony concluded and the gathered guests rose in warm applause, Elena and Julian stood together at the front of the hall that had once held such painful memories, now transformed entirely into a symbol of everything they had both overcome, individually and together, to arrive at this moment. Outside, as the celebration continued late into the evening, Elena stepped briefly onto the same marble steps where she had once stood in shock and humiliation, catching her breath after walking away from the life others had tried to assign her. Julian found her there a few minutes later, joining her quietly on the steps, watching the city lights twinkling in the distance. "Any regrets?" he asked gently, studying her expression carefully. Elena considered the question honestly before answering, looking out at the same view that had once witnessed her lowest moment. "None," she said finally. "Everything that happened, even the painful parts, led me here, to a life I built entirely myself. and to someone who finally learned to see me the way I always deserved to be seen." Julian reached for her hand, and Elena let him take it, no longer guarded, no longer uncertain, simply present in a moment that belonged entirely to the two of them, built on years of patience, growth, and genuine understanding, rather than a careless glance and a hasty rejection. "Thank you," Julian said quietly, "for giving me the chance to become someone worth choosing." Elena smiled, squeezing his hand gently, as they turned to walk back toward the celebration together. "Thank you for actually becoming him." Behind them, the grand hall glowed warmly with golden light, no longer a place of humiliation and rejection, but a testament to how much both of them had grown, individually and together, in the 5 years since a careless moment had once threatened to define them both. Elena Whitmore had walked out of that room once, refusing to accept a fate chosen carelessly by someone else. Now, she walked back into the celebration on her own terms, having built a life entirely her own, and having finally, freely, chosen to share it with the man who had spent 5 years proving himself worthy of standing beside her.